The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong to the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
All right, friends. Well, welcome back for literally our final class of Education Week. Thank you again for being here and enduring all the way to the very end. You guys really are the best. Let's go ahead and just jump right into it. Today, as you know, is our final lecture in a four-part series where we're looking at the book of Revelation. But as you know, if you've been coming to this class, the way that I've wanted to approach the book of Revelation in this series is not the way that we often do. And as you know, there are lots of different ways in which we could interpret the book, lots of ways in which it has been interpreted. It's a very exciting and sometimes anxiety-inducing book, right? And often we look at this book as it's a prophetic blueprint of events right around the corner in the 21st century and so forth. And maybe, okay, that's maybe how it's all about. But the reality is, I think that there's a more interesting way to read the book. So I'm not dismissing other interpretations by any means, but I do want to provide another lens, which is by looking at what this book would have sounded like, not to modern 21st century readers of the Bible, but what this book would have sounded like to first century readers to whom the book was originally addressed. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and finish this series where we're looking at the book of Revelation in its first century context. Now, I know that we've done these introductory slides almost every night. So if you've been here every night, I am sorry for the repetition, but I always suspect there's a handful who are just joining us for the first time. So let me just remind you of what we've done so far, because I really do think these are important building blocks for a solid foundation reading of this book. So if we're looking at what did this book mean to its original audience, we need to first understand the genre of literature. We did that on Tuesday. We need to understand the original historical setting of the book. We've been trying to do that a little bit throughout. And then finally, these are the two most, what I think are most important things for a good grounded reading of the book in historical context. That being, number one, is we need to appreciate the extent to which the book of Revelation draws upon Old Testament scripture, images, prophetic writings, etc. So I hope that you're now much more attuned to that, and that you're more now in that habit when you personally turn to the book of Revelation or teach it in your Sunday school classes in the next couple months. I hope that one of the things you'll be now in the habit of doing is always asking, how does this relate to Old Testament scripture? Because that is a frame of reference that the first readers of the book would have had as one of their primary frames of reference. So a good study Bible will help you with those connections. And then secondly, the other thing I hope you're now very attuned to is not jumping to questions of modern relevance. I mean, maybe there is modern relevance, and maybe there's all sorts of cool connections you can make to the modern world. But primarily, I hope that the first connections that you make is what significance would these symbols have had to the Christians who are receiving this book in the first century Roman world? And if you can get used to asking those questions first, then I think you'll find that your modern application of material like this will be much more informed, much more responsible, and a little bit more anchored in original intent, if that makes sense. So I think these are good scripture study habits to get into generally, particularly when it comes to the book of Revelation. Now, we will go through this quickly because we've already talked about the historical setting of the book, second half of the first century, writing to 7 churches that are scattered in these 7 cities in Asia Minor, which is in Western Turkey. You can see the green dots where the 7 churches, or the network of 7 house churches existed that John the Revelator is writing to. And 2 more quick slides by way of review. Don't forget that the circumstances behind this book are critical for understanding the significance of the text. These are believers in Asia Minor who are experiencing some kind of persecution, some kind of social marginalization by way of their experience in the Roman Empire. Some members of this community are being pressured even to participate in forms of local emperor worship. Right? They're being pressured as part of their civic duty to participate in religious practice and ritual that's part of the Roman religious structure, the Roman ritual system. And that this author is trying to convince the writer or the readers to not participate in those systems. And there do seem to be some in this community who are so tired in their discipleship. They're so kind of worn down by the social cost that comes from being a Jesus follower in the Roman world, that they are actually starting to, what this author might refer to as backslide. They're starting to go back to Roman ways of living that the author does not see as conducive to the Christian walk of discipleship. So at the end of the day, what is this book about? This book is a message to those original first century Christians, urging them to faithfully endure their persecution, faithfully endure their social marginalization, and be separate from the evil Roman system that this author sees literally as Babylon. I know I keep using the word literally. I need to work on that. It's not, right? Symbolically, it is Babylon, right? And while they're trying, he's encouraging these readers to extract themselves from Roman economic and social systems. He's also trying to encourage them to await God's ultimate triumph. Hang on, have hope. God will ultimately win in the end, and your sufferings in this Roman system will come to an end. In the end, this book is a prophetic critique of Roman society, prophetic critique of Roman conquest, Roman violence, Roman economy, Roman blasphemy. As we said a couple times already, this is a very anti-Roman book. So to understand it in its first century context, that's the lens that you need to have on. And tonight, we're going to finish the book. We're going to look at the last, 10 or 11 chapters of the book, and we're going to see how this author brings that message to its apocalyptic, symbolic conclusion. So the way that the book is structured, as we have now looked at, is it starts with the introduction. There's the opening vision of chapter 1. We've already now gone through the letter to the 7 churches, identifying the house churches by name and giving them promises if they overcome in faith. And yesterday, we looked at the vision of the heavenly throne room, which reminds the audience that God really is omnipotent. He is Pantocrator. He is the Almighty, the All-Powerful. So you can have hope that ultimately he will win. And then last time we saw the unscrolling of the 7-sealed scroll, where all sorts of really powerful images came out of the scroll, which we suggested last time, directly related to things that they were experiencing in the Roman world and can easily be read in that light. So today, we're going to now go to the final visionary segment of the book. Chapters 12 through 22 concludes the book. It's a very long conclusion, obviously. It's a second half of the book, where now the author will describe a vision of heavenly warfare and God's ultimate triumph as he initiates the new creation. So here's how I want to do this tonight. There's a lot of really cool material here. And if you were here last night, you might be surprised that there is still, in fact, 10 to 12 chapters left. Because at the end of chapter 11, we ended on this climactic note of God's victory. Babylon fell, God triumphed, and the saints were saved. And here in chapter 12, it's almost like we start over. It's like we have a whole new retelling now of probably that same story, but now with a new set of symbols. So in a moment, I'll talk about the relationship between chapters 6 through 11 and chapters 12 through 22. I'm not making this sum because but I think that there's going to be a really close relationship to those two passages. Okay, so how does chapter 12 through 22 work? In this case, it's helpful to see a bird's eye view first. So let me give you the big picture of how 12 through 22 operates. Here's how it goes. Chapter 12 begins with a vision of 2 apocalyptic symbols, a dragon, a red dragon, and a woman. And these 2 images represent this cosmic warfare that's been going on literally since before the world was created. Beginning in the heavens, there was a war between good and evil, between Michael and the dragon, between the angels and the demons, between God and Satan. And that war, which started in heaven, now continues down on the earth. That's why the righteous people suffer, according to this author. That's why we are persecuted by Rome. Rome are the agents of the bad guys. In that heavenly war, that war is just continuing here on earth, and Rome represents the demonic forces of that ongoing cosmic war, here symbolized by a dragon versus a woman in flight. A very powerful apocalyptic dichotomy, a juxtaposition of a very powerful, scary beast versus a woman running from the beast with a child. And somehow those 2 entities are going to be locked in conflict as the war comes down to earth. Well, in chapter 13, we now get to see the earthly agents of the demonic forces. So chapters 13 through 15, right, are basically like, it's like you're at the beginning of a boxing match or something, and you're like, okay, so let's meet our contestants, right? In this corner, we've got, and then we get to see in chapter 13, all of the earthly agents of the demonic forces. And we've got the beast, and we've got the Antichrist, and we've got, all right, and in this corner, and now we turn over to chapter 14 and 15, right? We've got the agents of God. We've got the Lamb. We've got the 144,000 on Mount Zion. So these chapters, juxtaposed the way they are introducing us to the earthly participants of the cosmic war of good versus evil. The beasts on the one hand, the Roman imperial state, and the Lamb and the followers of the Lamb on Mount Zion on the other. And once we've been introduced to the earthly manifestations of the cosmic war, we then see him rumble. As we ready to rumble, and then we get to it. We have the bowls of wrath being poured out. We've got the battle of Armageddon, and we've got the ultimate conclusion of this conflict on the earth with the fall of Babylon. Those beasts, as powerful as they might seem right now, will fall, and they will fall in an instant once God does his redemptive work. And then finally, once that beast falls, once Babylon disintegrates overnight, then we see the return of Jesus in glory. We see the new Jerusalem coming from the sky, and we see all things made new. Okay, so I wanted to start with that overview, because I think if you have that overview in mind, it's almost like a helpful roadmap to navigate the book. We're going to see a lot of bizarre images again tonight, just like we did last time. But I think the big picture can help you to navigate those images, seeing it as a war, the earthly agents of the war, the conflict on the earth between those characters, and God's ultimate triumph. So having given that overview now, let me quickly remind you of ways we could interpret this material. Okay, obviously tonight we'll have a historically rooted interpretation, but this very material obviously has been seen through the lens of the different interpretive schools that we've been talking about for the last 3 nights. If you are an early Protestant reformer, you will read this material as a historicist. Not to be confused with historical setting, that's what we're trying to do tonight. A historicist reading of the book of Revelation sees all of these symbols as some kind of like symbolic prophetic survey of all of Christian history, culminating in God's triumph with the Protestant Reformation. And in that historicist read, of course, images of Babylon, the prostitute, the Antichrist, the beast, all, of course, for Martin Luther refers to what entity? The Catholic Church. So from that interpretation, right, the Catholic Church is Babylon. If you've ever seen anti-Catholic readings or interpretations of the symbols we'll read tonight, you know that you're reading the book of Revelation with Martin Luther and John Calvin. That's how they read the book in light of their own political anxieties. Others, of course, read this material as futurists. Others see it as, it's not surveying Christian history. It's not about the Catholics. It's about whatever global political crisis is right around our corner that we as modern 21st century readers are fearing. That's what this book is about. And that's where you get, the helicopters and the Israeli army versus the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese and whatever political party you don't like. Right? Futurist readings are really wild and kind of fun, but man, they're out of control. Okay, because there's nothing to anchor them. It has to be rewritten every decade. That's the challenge with futuristic readings of the book. And then, of course, there's the idealists, which is everyone, guys, just calm down. It's just a symbol. It is good and evil, and good's going to win. Come on, it's a really easy book to read. Okay, so these are the different ways you could read this book, and has been. And check out the different readings. I, of course, have my predilections, but I think that if you explore these interpretive options, you'll find things that you enjoy. Okay, but what we are going to do is actually look at them from a historical perspective. So from a historical, meaning how would this have sounded to the first century? This is sometimes called a preterist reading of the book. From a first century perspective, you will see things like this. You will see things like the events of the first century that the readers would have personally experienced, or maybe they were concerned about, or were giving them difficulties or trials or tribulations. Things like, let's say, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem with the violent Roman suppression of the first Jewish revolt, which this audience lived through in all of its violence and cataclysmic destruction. Or maybe it's other Roman military enterprises or conquests that this author sees as doing the work of the devil on the earth. This author clearly sees the Roman imperial state as demonic agents. And we'll see those images tonight play out. In which case, from a first century historical read of the book, these symbols reflect the anxieties of these people in the Roman world and their hopes that one day God will bring that to an end through the victory of Jesus. So that's going to be the lens that we're going to have on tonight. So, know that the other lenses exist. Go check them out, get some popcorn, sit online, go down the rabbit hole, have a great time. But as always, I really feel like this historical approach helps anchor us as readers. It helps anchor a responsible interpretation, a responsible application of the book. So it's well worth our time. All right. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get to it. So if we turn to Revelation chapter 12, which hopefully you have it all in front of you. Oh, excuse me. Oh, man. I hope that you have a text in front of you, either electronically or through your physical Bible, because given the time tonight, we won't be able to read long passages together. I have to do a lot of summarizing, but I want to make sure that you stay close to the text personally, so keep an eye on it as we go. So let's go and start with Revelation 12, the beginning of this final visionary segment of the book. So as I mentioned, Revelation 12 sets up the idea that there was war in heaven. Okay, apocalyptic literature as part of this genre. Remember, Revelation is not the only one of its kind. Other Jewish apocalyptic texts read just like this as well. And they often have this theme that the conflict that we experience here on earth as God's people started in the heavens. Revelation continues with that theme. It started in the heavens. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels versus the dragon and his angels. Right? And they were in this conflict. But eventually in the chapter, where does the conflict go? Well, the conflict comes down here to earth. And it just continues down here. And the two symbols that chapter 12 gives us to reflect the two parties as they are coming down from heaven and coming down to earth is a red dragon and a woman. A very powerful, frightening image representing Satan's forces on the one hand. That's going to be a red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. And the other image representing God's forces or God's people, God's community on the earth, is an extremely vulnerable image of a woman fleeing in the desert with her baby, being chased by the dragon. Because if you are a member of one of these house churches in Asia Minor and you feel like the entire weight of the Roman economy and system and violence and religious pressure is all coming down on you, sometimes it can feel like you are in that vulnerable position of a woman fleeing with her child, being chased by the inevitable dragon who's just going to devour. It's only a matter of time before that thing gets you. It's a scary image. And that's how the book begins this visionary section. Okay, Satan's kingdom, the red dragon, versus God's kingdom, the woman fleeing into the wilderness with her child. I may have gotten a little bit carried away this afternoon as I was doing Google image searches and trying to find what would these things have looked like in Roman art. And I did find some ancient dragons in Roman mosaics. They're sea creatures, actually, right? So you can imagine these sea creatures, these Leviathan-like characters in their Hellenistic or Roman guise, like you see on the right. And I also found some really cool images of mothers and little children there, which you see on the left. The middle one is a mother with her little child, just to juxtapose those positions as the author is trying to do for you symbolically. On the far left is the image of Selene. She's the female personification of the moon. She's a moon goddess, because don't forget that the book of Revelation describes the woman with child as being surrounded by the moon, the stars, and the sun. That is an iconographic image that would have been recognizable in the Roman world as you think about female deities connected with astral images. In any case, sorry, getting a little carried away, a little tangent there. All right, so now that we've set up this warfare coming down here to earth, and now that we've seen this war in heaven, Michael versus the dragon being cast out, the warfare continued on the earth with the woman being chased by the dragon. Got carried away. Here's more dragons and more women with more babies. You get the idea. All right, but now we turn to chapter 13. And chapter 13 begins what I can only describe as the introduction of two competitors in a boxing ring, right? This is where we get to the in this corner. So chapter 13 is in this corner, we have the earthly agents of the dragon. Okay, so who are those earthly agents of the dragon? What do Satan's forces look like physically in our conflict here in the first century province of Asia Minor? Well, the images of this size. So in this corner, we've got 2 beasts. And both of these beasts, by the way, draw heavily on imagery taken from Daniel chapter 7. Here's where some of our Old Testament intertextuality really comes into play. You cannot understand the significance of the 2 beasts of Revelation 13 without having a firm grasp of Daniel chapter 7. Remember, Daniel 7, our first full-blown biblical apocalypse, the first full-blown biblical text that writes in this literary genre, operates with beasts representing earthly kingdoms, evil earthly kingdoms who are devouring God's people. 4 beasts come out of the ocean in Daniel's vision. and devour the saints. And Daniel cries out to God, when are you going to stop this? And the answer is, well, God is going to stop it by sending the messianic figure, the Son of Man on the clouds, to destroy the earthly beasts and save God's people. Well, this author of the book of Revelation is taking those images from Daniel and applying them directly, lock, stock, and barrel, even with a few modifications, to the first century Roman world of his audience. So the first beast we see coming from the ocean, just like in Daniel 7. This beast has 7 heads and 10 horns, and each one of the horns has crowns on it. Again, internet art can be a little limited on some of these Revelation images, so I do my best, but hopefully these help to at least give a sense. If you are an artist, I would really love to see the way you artistically depict some of these bizarre images. Here's one. Okay, so here's a 7-headed, 10-horned beast with the 10 crowns coming out. Now, what we are told about this beast from Revelation 13 is that he has direct authority from the dragon himself. This beast is the direct agent of Satan, the dragon from the beginning of chapter 12. This beast blasphemes against God, against the God of Israel, the true God of the cosmos. This beast, just like in Daniel, makes war with the holy ones, devouring the saints. This is the great mechanism of persecution for God's people. And all the people on the earth who are not being persecuted by the beast, in fact, worship this beast. Okay, we'll come back to possible interpretations of this in a second. The second beast, sorry, I actually couldn't find a second image, so maybe there is a better image out there, but we'll keep looking at this one. But there is actually a second beast. Okay, Revelation 13 talks about how then there's a second beast that actually emerges from the earth. The first one came from the sea. The second one is on the earth. It has 2 horns. And this beast, so if the first beast was the agent of the devil, of Satan's agent on the earth, this second beast on the earth is the creepy henchman. Right, it's like the worm tongue guy, right? Or he's the guy who's going to be doing the dirty work, the bidding of the original beast. So the second beast is going to force everyone on the earth to worship the first beast, whoever that agent of Satan is. The second beast, by the way, is actually going to have a number. The number of the beast. You ready for it? 666. Ooh, kind of exciting. In fact, anyone who wants to buy or sell, anyone who wants to be part of the system of this world has got to engage by receiving the mark of the beast. Okay, so as you know by now, if you were to go online and say, what are the 2 beasts of Revelation 13, your fun will begin, right? You'll read early Protestant reformers telling you all about how the Catholics are evil. You'll read wild futuristic interpretations about whatever political party you don't like, right? It's all there, and you're going to just have a blast. But from our historical perspective, though, from this reading, how might first century readers have viewed this? Well, it's actually not too hard to imagine how a first century reader seeing the Roman Empire as evil would have read this. Sometimes we talk about the book of Revelation as being, it's so coded in symbolism, it was meant to hide its true meaning from Roman authorities. Just the opposite. You do not need to be the sharpest knife in the Roman drawer to pick up what these images are meant to signify. All right, let's take a quick look. What is that first beast? Well, the first beast almost certainly is the author's adaptation of the beast from Daniel 7, only making the first beast now the Roman Empire. 7 heads, 7 Roman emperors, most certainly. Probably not a coincidence that if you start counting with Julius Caesar and go through Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Galba, you end up with Nero the 7th. Nero is the first Roman emperor to officially persecute Christians in the Roman world. It's called the Neronian persecution. The persecution in which Peter and Paul traditionally are said to have died in Rome. Now, it's interesting because in the text of Revelation 13, we read that this beast gets a death blow to the head, but then it comes back again. That's interesting because in the first century, at the very time of this text's composition and its audience, there in fact was a legend that Nero, the Roman emperor, the 7th from Julius Caesar, who was the first persecutor of Christians, after he commits suicide in 68 AD, there was actually a rumor that he was going to come again, that there's going to be a revival of Nero. And so this image of that beast getting a death blow to the head, but then coming roaring back, was an actual living anxiety of early Christians in the late 1st century. When is Nero going to come back? Well, in any case, what is the blasphemy? Well, don't forget that part of Nero's imperial propaganda campaign was to proclaim himself a living deity, right? And to proclaim himself, and you can see this in imperial Roman inscriptions, kind of propaganda inscriptions throughout the Roman world, declaring Nero to be the Almighty God or even the savior of the world. That's imagery that is not only found in the Gospels applied to Jesus, it's in the Gospels applied to Jesus because it's a political statement against Rome, saying that it's not Nero who's the Almighty God, it's not Nero who's the Savior of the world, it's Jesus. Well, the book of Revelation seems to be doing that same thing, right? In this case, it's saying that by Nero claiming to be the Pantocrator, the Almighty, by Nero claiming to be the Savior, as we can see in all the imperial Neronian inscriptions around the empire, right? That's the blasphemy of the first beast. The first beast is Rome, Satan's agent on the earth. All right, what about the second beast then? Well, the second beast are the henchmen of the first beast. If you are living in Asia Minor in the first century, who are those henchmen? Well, they're the local magistrates who are doing the actual work on the ground of trying to convince or compel populations to, in fact, worship the first beast. It's not a coincidence that it's in Asia Minor in the late first century, right, when and where this text is written, that we have our earliest manifestations of the imperial cult, the emperor cult, meaning you go to the emperor, the altar, the shrine dedicated to the living emperor, and you make a sacrificial offering dedicated to the divine living emperor as part of your civic obligations, as part of your show of loyalty. And local magistrates in Asia Minor were trying to ingratiate themselves with Rome by requiring their citizens to do this, the very location where the audience of Revelation exists. So it seems very reasonable, and we'll see even more reasons why here in a second, that the second beast is in fact the magistrates in Asia Minor who are enforcing the emperor worship. The image of the beast in that case is the imperial cult. That's the image that they're forcing them to worship. Well, what about this number of the beast? Oh, the 666. Is that the World Wide Web? Is it all sorts of great? In the first century, this actually, again, was actually pretty straightforward. As you probably know, in ancient languages, this is Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, all of the languages of the biblical world, they did not have individual characters for numbers. Instead, each letter of the Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Latin alphabets themselves represented a numerical value, meaning any given name, right, the combination of the letters that make up your name, if you just add the numerical value of each letter, your name actually has a numerical, like a value to it, which allows ancient Jewish writers to have all sorts of fun in apocalyptic literature, because you can call people out by their number, right? The Gospel of Matthew starts off by doing this. The Gospel of Matthew, the introduction, the genealogy of Jesus, 3 sets of 14 generations. Well, 14 was the numeric number of the numeric value of David. Jesus is a new King David. These are number games and letter games and name games that Jewish writers are using frequently. And the book of Revelation is firmly within that world. That world. Okay, so 666. Well, it is quite interesting that 666 is, of course, the numerical value of the name Nero. Okay, so here's what's interesting about this. So 666 is the numerical value of the name Nero, the Roman emperor that we've been discussing, the first imperial persecutor of Jesus' followers. And in the most manuscripts that survive of the book of Revelation, it is 666, which is the Neron Caesar of that you'd get from Greek into Hebrew. If you take the Greek, it's a little complicated, but that's how that works out. Now, it's fascinating because there are certain manuscript variants. In other words, other surviving manuscripts of the book of Revelation that don't have 666. They have 616 for the number of the beast. And you might think, oh, see that, they're just making stuff up, until you realize that 616 is the numerical value of Nero going from Latin into Hebrew. So one's going from Greek into Hebrew, the other's going from Latin into Hebrew. So in other words, in both manuscript traditions, it's clearly pointing to the same dude. It's Nero, right? It's not, anyway, don't get me started on what it's not. But so from a first century perspective, it seems pretty clear that this is the cultural orbit of the original readers. So what is then the mark of the beast? What is this thing that everyone needs to buy and sell? And right? I think it's actually pretty straightforward. Nero, as part of his economy, is minting coins with his image on it, and you need those coins to buy and sell. You need to be part of the Roman economy if you're going to live in this Roman world. Okay, I don't think it's actually too much more difficult than that. Nothing about microchips or anything like that. All right, so anyway, so Neronian coinage, I think, is a really good candidate for how early Christians would have read this image. And by the way, if this is the first time you're hearing this approach, please know that this is not idiosyncratic. This is not like me making stuff up. There is a well-established body of scholarship. In fact, I would say the vast majority of New Testament scholars who are academically trained as historians and as textual scholars who study the book of Revelation, I'm just basically summarizing that body of scholarship. So any study Bible that you get, any of the really great academic works that try to read Revelation in context, they will all kind of point in these directions. So I would encourage you to go check out some of these really cool reads to get a sense of life on the ground in these provinces and how these images would have been in play to the original readers. So for example, if we're thinking about the Roman world as an economic system and a Roman emperor as an agent that needs to be worshipped. And then you look at the material remains, the material culture, the archaeological ruins of the churches of Asia Minor, you will see this imperial propaganda everywhere. And it really creates a nice framing for this reading of the book. So for example, the urban institutions throughout Asia Minor are all designed to be expressions of imperial power. The arched gateways that you would enter to go into many of these cities would have inscriptions honoring the emperor and the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that he provides. It is, of course, a peace that is only brought through military conquest and military occupation. But that's the imperial propaganda. Or the aqueducts, the channeling of fresh water into these cities so you can take baths. You can bathe. That's exciting. Go to the bathhouse. You can even go to a public latrine. That's luxury there, right? Or you can even have fresh drinking water. Those aqueducts are paid for by imperial funds. And of course, there are inscriptions that remind you this is all courtesy of the emperor. The paved roads, gifts from the emperor. So these are all things that remind you on a regular basis, you owe this living, this lifestyle to imperial Rome. Okay, this seems to be the economic system that this author is very, very opposed to. Okay, so let's keep moving. Okay, so that's chapter 13, setting up the earthly agents of Satan on the earth as kind of the Roman imperial system. Now let's turn chapters 14 through 15. Now let's see who's over in this corner. Who represents the good guys? Who represents God's people on the earth? Well, in this image, we've gone from a dragon and a woman. Now we're talking about beasts, and we're talking about a lamb on Mount Zion with the faithful who have God's seal on their forehead. In fact, we see the 144,000 again. Remember them from the last unit, the last visionary segment, the 144,000 that were sealed up with God's seal on their forehead so that they could survive the plagues of the seventh seal, just like the Exodus? Well, they're back. We see them again, only they are with the Lamb on Mount Zion. They have the seal of God's in their forehead. So if everyone following the beasts are using Roman imperial coinage with the image of Nero or Domitian, the emperors, in this corner, the mark is the seal of God on their forehead. So they both have their marks. They both have their seal. They both show where their real loyalties are. And with that, the 144,000 on Mount Zion sing a new song before the throne. Last time we saw many passages in the book of Revelation that erupted into cacophonous praise, amazing hymns of praise in the heavenly throne room. Well, now we get another beautiful hymn of praise on Mount Zion as those who have the seal of God on their forehead are praising the Lamb. And then the four beasts and the 24 elders, they're back. They jump into the song too. Okay. Oh, and yeah, of course, my afternoon wanderings on Google Images. Here we go again. Now we have a dragon versus the beast versus the lamb. Right? I just thought that was kind of fun. Okay, so in chapters 14 and 15, then, now that we've introduced the agents of God's kingdom on the earth, now the rumbling is ready to begin. Now we're ready to ring the bell and watch the conflict go. It kind of always reminds me of that great scene in the Narnia movie where the two armies are coming together and in slow motion, and then all of a sudden they just clash. Well, that's where the chapter 15 and following goes. So the war begins on the earth. The final battle begins between these two forces on the earth when the seven angels from heaven blow their trumpets. Here are two different styles of Roman trumpets right here, in fact. Right, so you're blowing their trumpets, and out of the heavenly temple, dressed in white robes with golden sashes. Do you remember how Jesus was depicted in the opening vision of chapter 1? The priestly robe and the sash. Well, these are more angelic priests of the heavenly temple wearing their priestly robes, right? Only they're coming out of the heavenly temple. And one by one, these seven angelic priests with the trumpet blasts come out and announce something or do something. And the one that we're most familiar with, of course, is the one in chapter 14 that I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven with the everlasting gospel. What is the message of that angel? The message is, Babylon, you are going down. Okay? And that's all it says, right? And then, as Latter-day Saints are like, yeah, that's like Moroni. Cool. Okay, but that's what's happening here. It's like the seven angels are coming down. They've got their trumpet blast. They've all got their message. They're announcing that Babylon the new name that we've just given to the beastly agents, right? Babylon, remember the ancient empire of Babylon that was kind of the bad guy of the Old Testament? Well, this author is now taking that image and now applying it to the bad guys of his day. And these angels are announcing that that system is going to fall. And with that, the 144,000, the righteous, start singing a song again, only this one channels the song of Moses from Exodus chapter 15, the song of deliverance, that God has the power to deliver us from our captors. An appropriate song for a group that's about ready to be delivered from the beasts of the Roman Empire. And now we're getting ready to rumble with the 7 plagues. The bowls of wrath are cooking, right? And the next chapter, the next bit, into chapter 15, now we're ready to dump out the bowls of wrath. So when the conflict begins, the two parties come into conflict. What the angels have on their side, their weapons, are these bowls that are filled with wrath, and they just start throwing the contents of the bowls down on the earth, down onto Babylon, right? And here are the sequence of bowls. You ready? They're all plagues. Some of these might sound familiar from yesterday, just like in chapters 6 through 11, the 7th seal. In this case, the bowls of wrath are first, boils upon Babylon. Second, the seas turn to blood. Second, the rivers turn to blood. Fourth, the sun scorches the humans there. Fifth, darkness and more boils, right? Sixth, the waters. Of course, we can't forget the frogs, right? Then we have the Battle of Armageddon. We'll come back to that in just one second. And then finally, the 7th one is the lightning and the hail, and then the shout, it is finished, like we're getting ready to wrap this thing up. So in other words, the way that the conflict actually works is through these bowls of wrath. Now, from different interpretive approaches, again, you can easily imagine, let's say futurists reading this book saying, oh yeah, these are all about the environmental cataclysms that are right around our corner, and we can start assigning various policies to whatever you don't like, or it's all that stuff, right? But from a first century perspective, again, our first stop when we're thinking of interpretation should be intertextuality. Is there something about this list that sounds familiar to you from the Hebrew scriptures? Well, if just like yesterday when we looked at the 7th seal, and there was almost the exact same lineup of plagues with the 7th seal, remember the 7 trumpets there? This is just repeating almost word for word the same one. What were they yesterday? They were a reflection of the plagues of the Exodus story. The images that God had the power to deliver his people from Egypt, which in the last segment, 6 through 11, the 7th seal, we saw seemed to be a symbol that God has the power to deliver his people from Rome. Well, now that we're retelling the story in kind of a different symbolic set of symbols, this one seems useful once again. So once again, I think the first stop to interpretation here has got to be its interconnectedness with the plagues of the Exodus. At its baseline, it is saying that God has the power to deliver his people from their new captors, Rome, and he's going to do it. However you want to interpret it beyond that, however you want to apply it to other days and times, that's up to your interpretive ideas. Okay, so anyway, so that's the 7 bowls of wrath. Now you'll notice, by the way, it's kind of fun because the 6th bowl of wrath has the Battle of Armageddon. And this is where we get that famous image of what is the Battle of Armageddon? Well, from a first century perspective, Armageddon would have already had cultural framing to it that would have given them some meaning. What is Armageddon? Well, here's the passage, Revelation 16, verses 14 through 16. The kings of the whole earth will assemble at the great day of the Lord. Remember, the Old Testament image of the day of the Lord is the day that the big empires fall. Assyria, Babylon, now Rome. And they will be assembled at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. In Hebrew, this is Har Megiddo, or the mountain of Megiddo. In Greek, the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew there is Armageddon. Okay, so this is a site that we know exactly where this site is. This is a site, you can see the archaeological remains of it there overlooking the valley of Armageddon, the valley of the hill of Megiddo, right? On a topographical map, I have circled it in red where that is. The reason why I want you to see where it's located on the map is because you'll notice that going all the way back to the Old Testament period, Megiddo, this very site that we're talking about, was the site that protected the valley pass through the Jezreel Valley. Since most armies and trade networks, economic caravans are doing all of their travel up and down the coast, they all have to go through this valley to work through the mountain pass, the Carmel mountain range and so forth, which means the site of Megiddo is literally guarding the pass through which all armies and trade must pass. which means in the biblical Old Testament world, Megiddo will naturally be the site of many battles. There are several battles in the Old Testament. You can read from Judges, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, of battles that take place right there at the foot of Har Megiddo, right? Because of its place and its strategic location as the guardian of the Southern Valley Pass. Okay, and here's an artistic reconstruction of what the archaeological site would look like in the Old Testament. So if you're a first century reader and you hear, oh, Battle of Armageddon, you're not thinking of Israeli fighter jets and stuff. You're thinking of, oh yeah, Old Testament. That's where a lot of battles occur because that's where empires rise or fall. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And I think it has even additional significance by the late first and early second centuries. I've got colleagues who are now excavating the Roman layers of this area around Megiddo. And what they are finding is at the time of the writing of this book, that very site is once again being used strategically by military, only now it's the Roman military. There's a large Roman legionary camp in the late first, early second century that's established right at the foot of Megiddo, overlooking the valley of Armageddon. So for this readership in the first century, Armageddon's association with the rise and fall of empires and the military assertiveness of Rome, literally by building a legionary camp, all of which could easily have informed the way that first century audience would have seen this as an image of a nation is about to fall. Okay, really interesting. So again, as you're thinking about this location, this site, you can think about the Roman legions coming through this very valley during the first Jewish revolt. You can think about the early Christian hopes that just like Babylon or just like not Babylon didn't end there, but just like other ancient empires had battles there. So there's going to be some kind of fall of Rome starting from there. But in any case, these are some historical considerations that you can think about as you're looking at the Valley of Armageddon going there today. It really is a beautiful area, and you can easily imagine lots of ancient armies traveling through that region. Okay, what time do we? 1:25. Okay, we're in good shape. All right, so now that we've gone through the 7 bowls of wrath, and we've seen the different plagues, once again, the Exodus being replicated in some way, right? Now we get to chapter 17 and 18, which is now we're getting back to the beasts. So now that we're seeing the war, now it's like we're taking a pause in the action just to take a look. Okay, how's the beast doing over here? And it's in these chapters, right? Chapters 17 and 18, or excuse me, chapter 17 mostly, that we are going to get a bit of a reframing of the beasts. I mean, they're still the beasts, they're still the bad guys, but this is where we're going to start now really heavily leaning into the image that those beasts, the Roman apparatus, is what we're going to call Babylon. Right, that ancient empire that was the symbol of debauchery and wealth and immorality in the Old Testament, what we're just going to call are the new bad guys by Babylon here. In fact, the new set of images for those earthly agents is the following: that Babylon here, or Rome here, is depicted as a prostitute riding the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, so now it's a prostitute riding the beast. In fact, and here he actually clarifies, well, what are the 7 heads? We've been talking about the 7-headed beast. What are those 7 heads? Well, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. This prostitute riding the dragon, or riding the beast. The woman, well, what's the woman? Who's that prostitute? Well, the woman is the great city that rules over the magistrates of the known world in the first century. Okay. Again, you don't need to be the sharpest gladius in the stack to figure out what this is actually talking about. Well, what is Babylon? Well, Babylon is going to make war with the Lamb and with the holy ones, so that those 2 images are still in tension. And then we clarify in chapter 7 that the kings of all of the different kingdoms and empires are fornicating with this prostitute. That's a pretty vivid image, right? But that's it. She's a prostitute. You're all sleeping with her. Right. Well, what is this stuff? Well, again, a futurist read might have all sorts of, it's whatever modern political entity you don't like. But from a first century world, right, it's hard to spell it out more clearly what this would have sounded like in the first century. The 7-headed beasts, Rome with its 7 hills. Rome was had always been known as a capital city built on 7 hills. If you've ever been to Rome, you probably have visited the 7 hills of Rome. So who's the prostitute? The prostitute is the city of Rome. Right? Some have suggested maybe there's some criticism of pre-70 Jerusalem in here. Maybe, but I think we're on very firm ground when we see the 7 heads, the 7 hills as Rome. So who are these 7 kings? Well, again, it's the Roman emperors. And depending on how you count, you can go from Julius Caesar to Nero, or depending if you count elsewhere, you can even make it up to Domitian. But it's somewhere within that cultural orbit. What are these 10 horns? Well, the 10 horns seem to be the Roman client rulers in Asia Minor who are forcing everyone to sleep with this woman. right, to sleep with this prostitute. By the way, I love this image here. This is one of my favorite numismatic or coin finds pertaining to this conversation, because on the map on the right, you can see the 7 hills of Rome, but on the coins, and by the way, these are Flavian coins. So these are coins that were minted and circulated by the Flavian dynasty, of whom Domitian is the third ruler. Domitian is probably the emperor in the time of this book. Nero was just a few before him. But anyway, the Flavian coins here, how do they depict Rome? A woman sitting on 7 hills. Like I said, you don't get, I mean, it's really hard to get clearer than that, actually, from a first century perspective. Rome is the goddess Roma, the victorious goddess, sitting on 7 hills with all of her enemies smashed underneath her feet. And here's a kid riding a dragon, and people forcing emperor worship, just because I found these images today and wanted to use them. Okay, so anyway, yeah, so this is the emperor worship that's being forced by the 10 horns, by the magistrates and so forth. Okay, well, anyway, are you enjoying this so far? It's kind of fun to see it from this lens, right? Again, I think this is step 1 in interpretation, and then whatever you want to do with it after that is fine, but I think this needs to firmly be in place for a careful, thoughtful, responsible reading of the book. All right, well, what's next? Well, in 18, now that we've seen Babylon, the prostitute, fornicating with all the local kings, we've seen all these images, now we get to see the final moment, the final battle. This is going to be in chapter 18. And in chapter 18, the angel, one of the 7 angels, will declare the fall of Babylon. Now, this is dramatic. It's really hard, unless you're carefully reading the text, to appreciate just how quickly this seems. In chapter 17, it feels like Babylon, the prostitute, all the kings of the earth are fornicating with her. That is indomitable. I mean, that's never going to end. It feels these moments of empire where it's like that will never come crash. It is the eternal city. It is the eternal empire. But chapter 18 says, not so fast. That whole thing, that whole Roman imperial system will come crashing down in a split second. In fact, it's going to happen so fast that everyone's going to be shocked at the speed of its fall. So the angel declares the fall of Babylon, very much like you can imagine the fall of Babylon, ancient Babylon in 539 BC from the Persians. Same thing then, by the way, the Persians came in, it was like literally the kings, Babylonian kings having a feast as the Persians are, whoa, the Persians are here. I get fell in a second. Well, that's how this author sees the fall of Rome. Right? The weeping of the rulers, the weeping of the Roman merchants, because in 1 hour, your judgment came. Literally 1 hour, you're in business, you're on top of the world, and the next hour, you're in ashes. In 1 hour, all of that wealth was made waste. It's a total destruction of Roman shipping, the Roman spice trade, the Roman slave market, everything that well-oiled Roman machine that was just never going to stop ends in an instant in chapter 18. And it's really fascinating to imagine all the Roman system, the shipping, the economic, the trade, the slavery, the oppression, the violence. This chapter clearly represents the early Christian hopes or the expectation that whole oppressive system and its institutions will fall in an instant. Well, what happens next? Well, with the fall of Babylon, we are now entering towards the conclusion of the book, which is the triumph of God, the triumph of God's people, and a slew of really cool images that come with that triumph. In chapter 19, the next image is that when this is going down, there is going to be a banquet hall that's going to be set for the saints, for the holy ones who have endured their persecutions, who have endured their sufferings. And once Babylon falls, those holy ones, the saints, are going to have a feast called the marriage supper of the Lamb. And look at this. Let us rejoice. Let us exalt. Let's give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. His bride has made herself ready. It's like a wedding feast. And to her, it has been granted to be clothed with fine linen, bright and pure. The fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints, the holy, set apart ones. And the angel said unto me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. That's a really cool image, which if you know your Old Testament literature, you might recognize as an event that scholars often refer to as the Messianic banquet of Isaiah chapter 25. Chapter 25 of Isaiah also looks forward to a day of God's redemptive power, a day of his redemptive action. And also in Isaiah 25 describes God's power, his redemption of his people, his salvation of his people as a feast in very similar ways to the book of Revelation. Look how this Isaiah 25 reads. When Isaiah sees the great feast of celebrating God's triumph at the end, he says that on this mountain, of course in Isaiah he's thinking of the mountain in Jerusalem, on this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of rich foods, a feast of well-matured wines. I mean, this is, 738 BC, a very good year, of rich food filled with marrow. Oh, and did I mention the well-matured wine? I mean, that stuff's going to be really popping, right? That's really going to be great, right? Because there's a word of wisdom right there. They're not eating, bacon's not on the table here, but the well-matured wine sure is. Right? Okay, and at that great feast, right, he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over the nations. He will swallow up death forever, and then, listen, beautiful language. Then the Lord God will wipe away tears from all the faces. The disgrace of his people he will take away from the earth. For the Lord has spoken, and it will be said on that day, this is our God. This is the one we've waited for. This is the one that we've endured for. We've trusted in, that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. The hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain. So as a result of Isaiah's really beautiful collage of images of this messianic feast or banquet, various Jewish groups, all the way through the time of Jesus and beyond, would often refer to this feast as a messianic event that they're looking forward to. The Qumran community, Dead Sea Scrolls, are always eating their bread and drinking their wine in anticipation of this meal. When they get together as a community, eat the bread, drink the wine, they're doing it, letting it point their minds forward to the great day when we will all do this with the Lord, eat the bread and drink the well-matured wine. Well, that's what the book of Revelation is doing here, right? That messianic feast is going to be part of the symbolic celebration when God finally destroys Babylon. Now, Babylon's not quite, the embers are still burning. And so in chapter 19, we get the final stomping out of the embers. And it comes with the return of Jesus. The way that chapter 19 describes the return of Jesus is really wild. It is really cool. Like, again, I really encourage you, if you're an artist, to try visually depicting this somehow. But it does not depict the second coming the way we often do in our chapel art or our foyer art, right? Where it's calmly coming down into, I guess, was it southern Utah? Where is he coming down in that painting? I'm not sure. But anyway, that's not where he's coming in these. In these, Jesus is coming on a white horse at the head of an angelic cavalry unit. This is Aragorn with the army of the dead storming the Pelennor fields, right? That's exactly how he's depicted here. He's on the horse, he's in red, and he is leading the cavalry unit, and they just come sweeping down, and whatever's left of Babylon is just wiped out in a moment, right? He's declared King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And by the way, the angelic hosts that are with him in the cavalry unit, they're like priestly warriors because they're wearing the priestly robes of the temple in Jerusalem, and they all come down and that I want to see depicted in more art. This is actually the best one I could find, but it gives you the idea of a burning Babylon and the angelic cavalry unit coming down with, that's the second coming according to Revelation 19. That's pretty interesting. Okay, anyway, so that's that. So what happens next? We're almost out of time, but we can do this pretty quickly. Well, chapter 20, this is where we get all the kind of wrapping up stuff. We get 1,000 years. Turns out chapter 20 of the book of Revelation is the only text in biblical scripture that refers to 1,000-year period of Satan being bound. This is entirely where we get our idea of the millennium from a biblical perspective. We have the judgment of the wicked. Anyone who had the mark of the beast, anyone who bought into that economy will be judged. And we have the resurrection of the holy ones. This is how apocalyptic literature works. This is how Daniel 7 worked. Right at the end, the saints were saved. The wicked were judged. The saints were vindicated. And that's what happens here too. And they will be priests unto God, and they will reign with him as kings and priests for that 1,000 years. You might remember the kings and priests imagery from the last two lectures. Here we have the final battle of Gog and Magog, because for some reason Satan's loosed again. There's a final battle. Doesn't say much about it. It does seem to refer to an event that Ezekiel also describes. And then there's the final judgment of all, and that's it. But it's not entirely it, because that's just the end of the conflict. Now we get to see the rebuilding. And the rebuilding of chapters, 21, 22, the final chapters of the book of Revelation, are probably among some of the most beautiful passages of all scripture. But again, we're so obsessed with the locusts and the helicopter, we're obsessed with all that stuff that we really miss the true beauty of this book. The concluding symbols representing God's ultimate triumph in chapters 21 and 22, this is really great stuff. Right, let's check it out. There'll be a new heaven and a new earth. So after Babylon is wiped out, all things will be made new. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth, it passed away. It was all washed away. And the sea was no more. And I heard a loud voice from the throne, back the heavenly throne room, saying, behold, the home of God is now among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them. And here again, he's channeling Isaiah 25. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death. There'll be no more mourning. No more crying, and pain will be no more. For the first things have all passed away. All the hardship, all the suffering, all the trials and tribulations of trying to be a disciple in that Roman system, It's all gone. And the one that was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." And literally, the new Jerusalem comes down from the heavens and supplants all the old stuff on earth. It is the new creation, the descent of the new Jerusalem. It's fascinating in chapter 21 to see how the author describes the descent of the new Jerusalem. He describes it as a four-squared cube. I know that sounds really odd, doesn't it? Why is this box coming down? That's a little odd. There are 12 gates, and at the 12 gates around this four-squared cube, they're all inscribed with the with angels and the names of tribes of Israel. At the foundations of the wall of this cube, it's precious stones. In fact, the 12 precious stones of the high priestly breastplate, right, are the foundation gems of this thing. The streets are paved of gold. It's a four-square cube. And then he says, "And I saw no temple in the city." Why? Because the whole thing is the temple of the Lord. The whole thing is the temple of the God Almighty and the Lamb. And the city has no more need of sun, no more need of moon, no more need of stars, because the glory of God will be its light. Its lamp will be the Lamb. So here we have it. Why a four-square cube? Well, if you go back to the Jerusalem temple, the four-square cube was the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was a four-square cube with pavements of gold, the gems of the high priest breastplate. It's basically what this author is saying is, when the new Jerusalem descends on the earth and makes all things new, it's the descent of the heavenly temple. The heavenly Holy of Holies, it's now on earth. That's why it's a cube. That's why the 12 precious stones, because everyone who's going to be there are going to be priests serving in the Holy of Holies, in that temple with God forever. A beautiful image. There's one final image, and this will be the last one. The final image of the book is really one of my favorites. This is where once the temple touches down, lands on the earth, now this book channels the really cool prophecy of Ezekiel chapter 44. You might remember in Ezekiel 44, Ezekiel also saw some kind of temple. And when that temple regained the presence of God, the glory of God came back down into that temple. You might remember in Ezekiel 47 that a spring of life-giving water burst forth from the side of that Jerusalem temple and spread out. And as it flowed out towards the Judean desert to the east, what happened? Everywhere that river went, the dead Judean desert came back to life. Trees, plants, flowers, trees of life. Everywhere that living water touches comes back to life. In fact, that water even heals the Dead Sea. It even hits the salt sea, and it all becomes a freshwater lake again where fish are and so forth. Okay, well, the book of Revelation sees that as the culminating event of when the new Jerusalem temple lands on the earth. That river of life-giving water from Ezekiel 44 bursts from the side. All things come back to life. The dead world, the embered ashes of the former world have all passed away. And now it's all been replaced by the true and living water from the heavenly temple. All of the Roman system is no longer needed. Why? Because Babylon has now been displaced by the new Jerusalem. The creation and healing power of God has now asserted itself for all time over the destructive, oppressive, and demeaning imperial power of the Roman state that gave this early first century community so many hardships. All right, we just went 2 minutes over time, but basically, that's it. So friends, I hope that was a helpful review of the content of the book of Revelation, but also more particularly a way of looking at the book that appreciates how its first century readers, its intended audience, would have seen these symbols. And I hope that two things have become very clear. Number one, that the intended statement of the book, that this book will be a revelation of Jesus Christ. Sometimes we lose that for the fog in this book. That's one of the stated purposes of this book. I hope this book revealed Jesus to you, just like it revealed Jesus to the first century readers, his omniscience, his omnipotence, the Lamb who had been slain but who now lives. And I also hope that its message of hope for those Christians living in that first century empire, once you come to appreciate its powerful message, can now be applied to later eras, later time periods, and our own journeys of faith in our own challenging world. So guys, thank you very much. It's been such a blast. Have a wonderful year, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.